Shalom, everyone. This is Aaron Lipkin from Israel, and it's such an honor to be here at the Virtual Defender Conference of Skywatch TV. I'm going to share with you a very special message, a teaching that I've been involved in the past few years, really researching the book of Exodus and trying to find some interesting stuff that I'm going to share with you. But first, I want to talk about the connection I have with the late Professor Adam Zertal. I've been involved in his research in the last few years, especially the discovery of the altar on Mount Ebal, described in the book of Joshua, chapter 8, and in Deuteronomy 11 and 27, the site of the blessings and the curses. But more importantly, the sites of the footprint structures identified by Professor Zertal as the ancient worshiping sites of the Israelites called Gilgal. When I attended Zertal's lecture about the footprint structures, I was really amazed because Adam Zertal, as a scientist, tried to look for parallels in the ancient world that could suggest similarities to the footprint structures. And Adam Zertal describes in his lectures how the Egyptian culture really affected the builders of those humongous footprint structures in Israel, especially the Israelites. The Israelites were in Egypt for many years, for some say 200, some say 300 years, and the Egyptian culture had some effect on the way of thinking of the Israelites, and so when they came to the land of Israel, they brought with them that type of thinking. At first, when I heard that, I didn't really feel comfortable with that. I always liked to think that the Israelites had a very clear, very pure belief, very pure symbols of belief that they brought with them from the desert, from Sinai. And so at first I felt some sort of an opposition to this type of thinking. But eventually things started aligning. And what Adam Zertal showed in his lectures is that the footprint structures, the symbol of the foot, bears a lot of meaning in the theology of ancient Egypt. And you can see many pictures where Pharaoh is sitting on his throne, and his legs are pictured as stepping over enemies of Egypt. And when we read the book of Joshua, we see that one of the main messages of the book of Joshua at the time when these footprint structures were built is the submission of the Canaanite nations by the Israelites. Wherever you will tread your foot will be yours. This is one of the main messages, the conquest. And so it's very logical that the Israelites coming out of Egypt would see the symbol of the foot as a symbol of conquest. And that is why, according to Professor Zertal, that's one of the reasons why they used that symbol of the foot. And he talks very in length about the other symbols of the foot in ancient Egypt. And I invite everyone to purchase Adam Zertal's book, The Footsteps of God, which describes very clearly the different meanings of the foot shape in the Bible. There are 4 categories that repeat themselves in the Bible, and according to Zertal, there's a very big chance that these symbols actually came from Egypt. So in the last few years, I've been researching this issue, and I've been learning about the teachings of Dr. Chagai Misgav, who has researched the book of Exodus, looking for any type of Egyptian symbols or Egyptian phrases that would appear in the book of Exodus. Now let's stop here for a second and talk about the Bible in general. The Bible is a book of faith. It is a book that was written under the inspiration, the divine inspiration of God. It was written by prophets, people who God spoke to. When we're looking at the Bible, we need to envision a library. We need to envision bookshelves with many books on them written by different people in different times, in different places. And so when we look at the book of Esther, for example, we read a book that was written by Jewish Persians, Jews living in Persia, ancient Persia. The book was written in Persia. There are many words inside this book that are from Persian. The names of the people, the heroes of the book, Esther, Mordecai, Xerxes the king, Haman, are all Persian names. And so here you have a very clear example of a book that indeed carries a lot of messages, important messages, many issues concerning morality and divine providence. But if we look at the book itself, if we look at the words, if we look at the language, we see a lot of Persian influence in that book. When we look at other books, the book of Daniel, again, a language, Aramaic. The whole book is most of the book is in Aramaic. You see all of these things, and you understand that there's always influence of the country, the place, the people who write it, the period the book is written in. These all have effect on the book itself in the Bible. And so what I'm going to try to show all of the participants here at the conference, the virtual conference, is traces of Egyptian influence in the book of Exodus. We have to understand the end of the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus are the time when the Israelites are most affected by Egyptian influence, Egyptian theology, Egyptian language. And when you have a people that's living for such a long time in Egypt, they bound to be affected by this culture. And so this is not something that threatens our faith in God and in the Bible, quite the opposite. And I'm going to talk about it in the end after I present the evidence in the book of Exodus. So without further ado, let's start with the Egyptian language. And you can see to my right an Egyptian phrase in hieroglyphs, which is the Egyptian writing. And what we're going to do is we're going to read this sentence from left to right. And so what we see is the first and second symbols are in Egyptian shesep, to give. Then we can see that there is a picture of a head. The head in Egyptian is called tep, and then the signs to the right of the picture of the head mean a way. And so if we read it from left to right, it says to give head way. The meaning of this phrase in Egyptian is to choose a way, to choose a direction. Why is this important? When we read the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verse 3, the Israelites are complaining to Moses. They're saying, why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword. Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And then, verse 4, and they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. When you read this phrase in Hebrew, and I will translate it from Hebrew to English very, very simply, the Israelites are saying, they're saying, we should give head and go to Egypt. And now when we're seeing this sentence of we should give head, we should give a head and go to Egypt, and we see this phrase that I just presented to you, we're actually seeing the Israelites speaking in Egypt, speaking in Egyptian. What they're saying is they're using an Egyptian phrase to say that they want to choose a way to go back to Egypt. Interesting. Let's see another example. Another example of how the Egyptian language actually appears also in the biblical text is in the book of Exodus. And I'm going to open a verse in Exodus 32, verse 12. The Israelites are again complaining. They're saying, why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? And so we have here, the Israelites are citing a verse that is going to be uttered by the Egyptians. Okay, the Egyptians will say, and the Egyptians are saying that God has brought the Israelites to the mountains to kill them in the mountains. And the question is, why mountains? I mean, the desert has valleys. The desert has various geographical formations. Why are the Egyptians saying mountains? And again, we're going to the hieroglyphs, the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And surprisingly, there is a sign in hieroglyphs, 3 mountains, which is called Chsut. And the translation of that sign, the 3 mountains, is foreign lands. And so again, why are the Egyptians saying that God has taken the Israelites to kill them in the mountains? Translated to Egyptian, to kill them in foreign lands, not in Egypt, but outside of Egypt. Another interesting example is the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis with the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh. We read the dream of the baker is very interesting. This is Genesis 40, verse 16. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. And so Joseph hears this, and he tells the baker the bad news that Pharaoh is going to kill him. And we've been reading this for centuries. But if we look at the Egyptian writings, if we look at the hieroglyphs, we see something very interesting. So again, to my right, you can see a sign which is really interesting. You see inside this sign, you see 3 separate symbols. The first symbol to the right is a dead man. To the left of the dead man is a bird, and under the bird is loaves of bread. This symbol together means death. And so when Joseph hears this, Joseph understands Egyptian, he understands Egyptian symbols, and he explains to the baker, who also knows Egyptian, exactly what his dream means, that he will be executed by Pharaoh. Moving from the Egyptian hieroglyphs to Egyptian symbols, you can see a picture to my right of a pharaoh holding two sticks. These sticks were the symbols of rule, the symbols of governance. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob blesses Judah. And in verse 10, he says, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet." And this is interesting now in light of the picture of Pharaoh holding these two sticks. Basically, what Jacob is saying is he's using the image of Pharaoh, the rule of Pharaoh, in context with Judah becoming the bringer of Messiah, the bringer of the King Messiah to the world. Interestingly, one of the scepters that Pharaoh is holding is called Hakka. And the reason why it's interesting is because when you read the Hebrew blessing of Jacob, that same verse, verse 10, one of those sticks is very similar to that word Hakka in Egypt, mechokek. And so this really strengthens the theory that when Jacob is blessing Judah, what he sees in his imagination of kinghood is Pharaoh holding the two sticks. Another important symbol in the Egyptian culture is the snake. And immediately when we hear snake, we immediately remember the story of Moses turning the staff into a snake in front of Pharaoh and his magicians. In Egyptian writings, the story of turning a staff into a snake or an alligator is something that appears quite frequently. There's actually a story about a magician that comes to Pharaoh Khofu from the 4th dynasty and describes how his staff was turned into a snake, or actually to an alligator, and took Pharaoh's opponent, killed him, and took him into the Nile. And so this is a story that appears in Egypt. And indeed, when Moses performs the miracle of turning the staff into a snake, Pharaoh's magicians also boast that they can do the same. And so you see that this is something that also comes from the Egyptian side. What the text is doing, what Moses is doing, he's speaking Egyptian. He's speaking in the Egyptian symbols, the Egyptian theology, the Egyptian language, in order for the Egyptians to understand what he's doing and why he's doing it. Another interesting word that appears in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 8, we read that there is a commandment for the Israelites to put something on their hands and their head to remind them of the exodus out of Egypt. The verse says, "Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads." Now, the word that's used for the sign on the forehead in Hebrew is the word totafot. Totafot was really read for centuries by Jews, and no one really knew exactly what this word means. It's not a word from Hebrew. And so if this is something that's supposed to remind us of Egypt, maybe it's from Egyptian. When you look in the Egyptian language for a word that resembles totafot, you find the word for a snake. The word snake in Egyptian is ddft, ditfet. And we can see the crown of the pharaohs that has a snake in front of their head, on their forehead, and there's two strips coming down the shoulders. So this was one of the symbols of kinghood, one of the symbols of Pharaoh. And the word totafot that appears in the Bible in Hebrew is actually an Egyptian word that's used for the Israelites to understand exactly what they need to do, or where they need to put it, this special sign. And so when the Israelites are seeing this, they're seeing the symbol of Egypt on their head, and it reminds them of the Exodus out of Egypt. DDFT, Totafot, and the sign of the phylacteries on the head. But in this case, we're not putting a snake on our forehead. We're putting the words of the law in scrolls inside the cubical sign on our forehead, which is different than the Egyptian pagan custom of putting a snake on the forehead of Pharaoh. Let's move to another example from the cult of the dead in the Egyptian culture. Where we see a picture here of Pharaoh after passing away. He is led to a courtroom where the pagan god Osiris, is watching the trial, and the Pharaoh is announcing that he has been righteous and did everything that he should have done, sacrificed his sacrifices, never used anyone in a bad way, any human being. And then after this declaration, the ceremony going in the underworld is that a feather is put on one side of a scale. The feather is a symbol of justice, a symbol of order, a world order. On the other side of the scale, the heart of Pharaoh is put. And this is the trial. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the heart goes up, then this means that Pharaoh is indeed righteous, and his status as king will continue in the next world, in the underworld. However, if Pharaoh's heart is heavy and the feather goes up, then Pharaoh is evil and he will be doomed. Why is this important for our knowledge? Because the only place in the Bible where we see the phrase heavy heart in Hebrew, lev kaved, is in the book of Exodus, when God says to Moses that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. In Hebrew, harden his heart is make his heart heavy. The only place in the Bible where heavy heart appears is in the story of Pharaoh, Moses, and the 10 plagues. And so again, the Bible uses Egyptian ideas, Egyptian language, in order to express the messages of the Bible also to Egyptians. The only place where a heart is heavy is in the story of the Exodus as we know it. We're moving from Egyptian symbols to Egyptian names. Today, if you walk in the streets of Israel and you meet an Israeli with the name Boris, most Israelis know that he's probably was born in Russia or the former Soviet Union, or maybe his parents immigrated to Israel from the Soviet Union, and he was born here in Israel and was given that name. But this is something that's well known, and it happens everywhere in the world with the names of immigrants. And so, when we're listening to the names in the book of Exodus, we find something really intriguing. First of all, Pharaoh, of course, is an Egyptian name. Pharaoh means the big house. Phar is house and O is big. But what about the names of the Israelites? And this is very interesting because in the tribe of Levi, we find names, a large concentration of names, which are Egyptian names. Moses, you would say, well, Moses was raised in the house of Pharaoh and he was given an Egyptian name. But Moses means son or deliverer in Egyptian. But what about the other names? Yours truly. My name is Aaron. Aaron is an Egyptian name. Miriam is also an Egyptian name. It means beloved. Phineas, Hur, and so many other names that appear in the tribe of Levi that are Egyptian. Later on, when we look at the book of Samuel, the sons of Eli, the priest, are called Hophni and Phineas. These are Egyptian names. This is in the tribe of Levi. So there are many theories about why this is so. Why does the tribe of Levi have so many Egyptian names in it? But this is, again, a very clear symbol of the effect of Egyptian exile, the Israelite exile in Egypt, and how that affected the Israelites living in Egypt, their culture and their thinking. So thank you so much for listening to this interesting lecture. And I invite you all to join our upcoming online course about the altar of Joshua. You can see a picture of the altar right here. This is probably the most important, the most fascinating discovery of a biblical artifact that appears in the Bible. You can find more information about this online course, 5 meetings with great lecturers, at altarofjoshua.com. And I really hope to see you there. Blessings from Israel and shalom.